Hello, and welcome to In Pursuit of Clarity, episode number 29, entitled The Spirit of the Law versus the Letter of the Law. As you may have sagely deduced from the title, I wanted to discuss the difference between the spirit of the law and the letter of the law, and why this difference is so important, and the understanding of this difference is so important. The spirit of the law represents its foundational purpose, its essence and reason for being. The letter of the law might best be thought of as the fleshing out of this skeletal structure, the branches of the root, the specific technical language used to help implement and enforce the law. To give an example, let's say a law on the books prevents anyone from using corporate funds for personal reasons, and an individual decides to take advantage of a perceived loophole, whereby he causes funds to be transferred out to a different company and then funneled from there to his personal account. By almost any objective definition, this would be a violation of the spirit of the law, but perhaps, in many cases, not the technical letter of the law. It strikes me that there's a very clear cultural difference in how this dynamic is viewed. Western or European peoples, especially in great antiquity, have always had great respect for the spirit of the law, and have focused far less on the letter. Whereas the Jewish people, to use a random example, have traditionally been very much the opposite. In fact, the Book of the Talmud, a core text of modern Judaism, is a masterclass in exactly this. With regards to law, it's an attempt to turn all spirit into letter. In ancient Germanic societies, they seem to have little concern or need of lengthy law codes. The same holds true among their relatives, the ancient Scythians, as recorded by all who encountered them. Everyone seemed to know the spirit of the law, and what was considered right and wrong, and were expected to act accordingly. In those strikingly rare instances in which this spirit was transgressed, they could expect a subjective judgment handed down from on high, as chieftains and leaders often doubled as judge and jury, and helped keep the peace. Failing this, if both parties wished it, they may even resort to physical combat as a last resort, a tradition somewhat similar to the more recent custom of dueling. There was a direct and meaningful consequence to the violation of the spirit of the law, a loss of reputation and honor, and possibly a loss of life or limb. It's been taken as a given by so many for so long that the progression of our law codes into Byzantine complexity has been a net positive. Specificity, after all, can certainly be helpful. What's gone largely unrecognized and undiscussed is just how this changes a society and its potential negative ramifications. Firstly, it transfers power away from what might be deemed natural leadership and into the hands of a new class of individuals, lawyers, for example. So whereas in ancient European societies, a man might be chosen for leadership and influence due to his strength of will, or charisma, or courage on the battlefield, or just because he was so well liked and respected by all around him, power and influence has shifted over time into the hands of those who wrote or interpreted laws, who over time gained power to both author and guide the enforcement of all rules and regulations. In a short span of time, much of the world shifted from being governed by concise and readily understandable codes of conduct, such as the Ten Commandments or the Laws of Manu in Aryan India, or Hammurabi's Code, into sprawling complexity, of a type and extent that no man could hope to familiarize himself with in a single lifetime. Not only did this usher a different sort of man and institutions into power, and change our conception of power itself, but it also opened the door to some extremely unscrupulous behavior, and in fact gave much of this behavior the veneer or facade of being justified or acceptable. Not only could a disreputable sort occasionally author laws in their favor, but they could include so many letters in this letter of the law as to attain almost limitless wiggle room. There's a reason the terms of service we read and are asked to agree to by so many products and services we make use of tend to be so lengthy. It gives the issuing party immense power. The devil is in the details, as the saying goes. And in such an immense collection of words, any legal expert then became capable of finding something within them when the need arose, allowing him to attack or defend almost any position. So much so that most of these experts could formulate an extremely convincing argument on both sides of almost any dispute, regardless of whether the individual in question was in the right or wrong. The further we moved from the spirit of the law towards the letter of the law, this question of whether an individual was right or wrong became almost irrelevant in actual operation. It instead became a question of whether it could be made to appear, using clever legal wrangling, whether the individual was right or wrong. What's worse, men willing to act unethically for personal gain now felt increasingly justified in doing so, as long as they could locate some technicality or some particular phrasing in the law that seemed to justify their behavior. And this holds true to the extreme in the economic sphere of modern capitalist America. The amount of financial corruption and fraud that occurs on a daily basis, merely because a clever legal team has managed to create a framework to cause it to appear otherwise, is stunning. Men who, if brought before an elder or patriarch in ancient times, would likely be shunned or banished, or face a significant loss of property, or even life or limb, now not only walk freely in our age, but often don't even face a slap on the wrist, and are even, frequently, held in the highest regard, due to the direct and indirect influence of their money or occupational or social position. It's my contention that this moving away from an emphasis on the spirit of the law and towards an obsessive immersion in its letter has harmed our nations and cultures in the most profound and fundamental ways. An overly technical approach to law can now allow the most disgusting scoundrel to walk free, and just as bad can allow for good men to be punished severely, and has transferred the most supreme powers to a class of men who no longer run the gamut of political or ideological worldview, but instead tend to share a fairly singular outlook. Recent studies bear this out, and only media and finance show a similar degree of homogeneity in their ranks. I mentioned the Talmud a moment ago, and it's a fascinating compilation from any perspective. You may know by now that it attempts to provide some justification to act unjustly to the other, to anyone outside of the ethnic or religious circle. But what's even more unique about the work is its manner of doing so. While it allows for, and in many cases even encourages, actions that may help one's in-group and harm others, it seems to repeatedly stress the avoidance of getting caught in doing so, and specifically speaks to the merits of causing these actions to be done through a proxy. Meaning, if one seeks to do another harm of any sort, instead of doing this harm directly, if you can find a means to cajole or force another individual to carry out this action, this is the ideal. To me, this epitomizes the most significant flaws in an exclusive focus on the letter of the law, and speaks to how a more elaborate and long-winded law code can act as a net negative. The Romans, perhaps as a reaction in part to this creeping legal complexity in their own age, developed a brilliant antidote of sorts, popularizing that phrase "que bono," or "who gains," as the governing principle of justice when prosecuting crimes. This helped strip away all of the clever talk and meaningless fluff and attempt to restore focus to a foundationally meaningful and telling metric. Finally, pull back from the utilitarian and legal conceptions for a moment, and consider what these different approaches say about the people that embrace them. On the one hand, we have a focus on the spirit of the law, in which each citizen can constantly bear in mind a few simple golden rules of behavior, and far more often than not knows clearly if he's transgressed them, and how to avoid doing so, and knows that if he falls short here, he's likely going to have to take full responsibility and pay the price. There's no clever means of escape or evading taking blame. On the other hand, we have a focus on the letter and technicality of the law, in which each citizen has some vague idea of the wording of the laws on the books, but knows if he's willing to pay a high-priced lawyer a significant sum of money, he has a good chance of creating the appearance that he did nothing wrong, or at least reasonable doubt as to his guilt. Or perhaps he does know relevant snippets of the massive tomes of laws pertaining to his actions, and was inspired to take the offending actions precisely because he knew he'd be able to frame the situation in a certain manner as to avoid punishment. Our age has taken it as a given, for the most part, that modern law, broadly speaking, is superior to that of past eras, and that a greater amount of textual elaboration grants us greater specificity, and thus greater clarity and superior justice. I disagree with this, and wanted to play a bit of devil's advocate here to spur some thought on the subject. Even more importantly, I'd like to spur some thinking as to what these different approaches to the law and to life in general say about the different peoples and cultures from whence they spring, and what fundamental contrasts they paint, and how these contrasts affect the interplay of cultures in the modern world. Understanding the core differences here is absolutely key to understanding the broader picture. And that's it for the moment. Thank you for listening.
This is the end, beautiful friend. This is the end, my only friend, the end of our elaborate plans, the end of everything that stands, the end